Good afternoon and welcome to the second segment of the Don Lafferty Hot Springs Spring 2022 webinar series. My name is Dr. Jerry Steele, Assistant Professor and Chair of the Doctoral Program in Educational Leadership at Russell Sage College. This webinar series is offered under the auspices of the Hot Springs Center at Russell Sage College in association with the New York State Council of School Superintendents. The Hot Springs Center was established in memory of Don Lafferty Hochsprung, the principal of Sandy Hook Elementary in Newtown, Connecticut. Dawn was a member of Albany Cohort 6 and had just completed her first semester in the doctoral program when that tragic day occurred. The mission of the center is to promote mental health and school safety. Our topic this afternoon is civility and engaging our school communities. Our panelists for this timely conversation include Dr. Tammy Pate, who serves as Superintendent of Community School District 28 in Queens, New York, where she observes, assesses, and develops school leaders while overseeing the management of 30 school and district budgets, state accountability, human resources, curriculum, and instruction. Prior to serving in District 28, Dr. Pate was the Deputy Community Superintendent in Community School District 10, one of the largest districts serving over 40,000 scholars across 58 schools, K-12 and 5 pre-K centers. During her time, she developed and administered the implementation of the My Brother's Keeper initiative and the New York State Integration Project initiative, managing cross-functional teams that blanket central offices, including student enrollment, district planning, community engagement, and accountability across New York City. She has over 18 years of experience as an educational leader and is a proud graduate of the Russell Sage Doctoral Program. Our next panelist is Dr. Kevin McGowan, who is the Superintendent of Brighton Central School District, a suburban school located in Monroe County. In addition to being ranked in New York State and nationally, Brighton schools have been recognized as schools to watch, Blue Ribbon Award winners, and as a 2018 U.S. News and World Report Gold Medal school. Their accomplishment is a 97% graduation rate for all students, with all subgroups achieving at or near the same level of success. The district has focused on success for all students. Dr. McGowan joined the district in 2009 following his superintendency in the Warsaw Central School District. Dr. McGowan was an elementary principal, high school assistant principal, and elementary teacher. Our final panelist is Dr. Elizabeth Wood, who is the deputy superintendent in the Shenandoah School District, just north of Albany, New York. As the academic leader for the district's 9,600 students, Dr. Wood is committed to providing a positive experience for every student and helping all students realize their full academic potential. Her work includes a strong focus on quality hiring practices to ensure the best candidates are identified for every position. Prior to serving as deputy superintendent, Dr. Wood served as assistant superintendent, elementary principal, middle school associate principal, and high school social studies teacher across 2 districts. Dr. Wood has a doctorate in educational leadership from Russell Sage College and is a board member of the Saratoga Hospital and the New York State Women in Administration. Our moderator for this afternoon's conversation is Dr. David O'Rourke, who serves as the district superintendent, chief executive officer of Erie 2 Chautauqua Cattaraugus BOCES in Western New York. Prior to his leadership of the BOCES for the past decade, Dr. O'Rourke served as superintendent of Silver Creek Central School District. He has served on the executive committee of the New York State Council of School Superintendents, is on the board of the directors for the Leadership for Educational Achievement Foundation. Dr. O'Rourke is an experienced leader in curriculum and instruction, educational policy, collective bargaining, and leadership and organizational development. It is with great pleasure that we have this panel and moderator this afternoon to discuss this timely topic of civility and engaging our school communities. Dr. O'Rourke.
Jerome, thank you so much. Thanks for that introduction for all of our panelists. on behalf of all of our panelists. I thought maybe we should get started just kind of acknowledging, just the challenging landscape politically that many school leaders and especially school superintendents and their key staff, how they're managing the political landscape right now with all of these new developments. I thought maybe Kevin, maybe you could give us just your thoughts on how do you manage these topics? We have pandemic, critical race theory, social justice concerns. How do you keep a tone that's respectful and cultivate civil discourse?
David, I'm glad you asked. I think that it is much less complicated sometimes than we make it, and it is, by the way, extraordinarily complicated times we're living in. And everything you just listed is, landmine after landmine. But I guess what I'm getting at is kind of going back to my core as a person, listening more than I'm speaking, right? Being thoughtful in my responses, being true to who I am and who my school community is expecting me to be, or our political perspective to be, relative to being thoughtful, standing up for those that need us to stand up for them, not yielding to the pressure of that, not allowing disagreeable to get in the way of discernment, and disagreeable to get in the way of disagreeing, which is okay. And just trying to over and over again foster an environment in our boardroom and in our meeting rooms and in the various circumstances where we have these conversations, where we're respectfully listening to each other, and always trying to go back to the idea that kids are watching us, our school communities are watching us. We're always teaching. We are teaching in our educational organizations in every meeting we have, and we should be modeling respectful civil discourse. And we should and can disagree, and that's all right. But let's listen to each other and be thoughtful about that. So as much as some things that come out of people's mouths might frustrate me, disturb me, although I wouldn't allow for there to be disrespectful discourse and hurtful language used towards other humans, I need to really check myself and listen carefully and be thoughtful and respectful of somebody's perspective that might be very different than mine, and just be patient with that and try and work through that. The only other thing I'd add, to not dominate the conversation, is that it is also about creating good systems for managing disagreement. In other words, being really thoughtful about security presence at meetings and what you want those security guards to do or not do. Prepare your board members for every meeting very carefully. Here's how we should respond. Here's how we shouldn't respond. Being very, very, very planful in that, because these things tend to spiral out of control when we're not thoughtful about our reactions. So just trying to create the right circumstance so that nobody puts themselves in the situation to make it worse.
Kevin, thank you for getting us started. I appreciate all of those thoughts. I could see Tammy nodding along with some of those points. Tammy, maybe tell us, and as we go here, maybe we can talk a little bit about the texture of our own contexts as we come to this table. So Tammy, maybe tell us a little bit about your story, where you're situated, and maybe how you might also approach just these political tensions, and how have you worked to try to keep things respectful and civil as you've led.
Yeah, absolutely, Dr. McGowan. Thank you so much for what you have laid out. And I was trying to control my habit of nodding and agreeing with my body. But I could not agree with you more in terms of setting protocols in place and thinking about, I think about Pima Sheldon, who said, ego seeks to divide, but the spirit seeks to unify. Or, the best way to destroy a relationship is to engage ego. Those kinds of things. I had a conversation with a group today who asked about how you engage a community that may or may not be struggling with a contentious subject or event. And it is all of what you have just said. One, that you have to find a common ground. And every day in every way, it's our scholars. Every day in every way, it is our scholars that unify us. Everyone wants to see their student be successful and to be prepared for life beyond this moment. And the second is creating protocols that help hold whatever structure you put in place. And by that, I mean being really clear about practice perfect. So for our district, we went through a fairly contentious period of time that was divided around equity concerns, that was divided around socioeconomic status, privilege and lack of privilege. And one of the things that was instrumental is speaking and note sharing, and even in the chat protocols for that. and then practicing with all of the panel and participants, right? So practice perfect. What do we do when we see the first instance of a desire of a behavior we don't desire to see? What do we do at the second? And then where's our sort of quit time? And so I agree 100% that having sort of finding the common ground, finding ways to redirect folks' thoughts, opinions, and actions back to what we hold as sacred, which is always our scholars, and then putting systems in place that help us stay true to what we intend. And that I could not agree with more. It really has saved our district from really splintering in a way that would in some ways be irreparable. And it did help us. So it's something I 100% agree with.
That's very helpful, Tammy. I wondered, Elizabeth, in your own district, maybe you want to tell us a little bit about Shenandoah and some of the things that you've experienced there. But how, as these new challenges came on, as there became kind of new texture to the politics of your local elections, the contentious issues in the community, what are some of the resources that you brought in to try to help support the direction of the district and how it can best engage its community in a constructive manner?
It's a good question about resources. I would first say that one of the things that we sometimes need to remind people of in the conversation, especially when the approach to us is how upset they are, is like, we are not your enemy. Public school is not your enemy. Your children's school is not your enemy. Like, we want what's best for your child. And very often when we can have a conversation about really what are you looking for your child, it is very rare that we don't want the same thing. So sometimes just stripping it away to what are you looking for? What are you hoping for? And occasionally does it happen that somebody has got something that's completely impossible to support? Yes. But very often when you really, back to the idea of critical race theory, I had one, interestingly enough, she was a grandmother, just speaking of the local context, call and what are you doing with this critical race theory? And you've got this equity and what's all this about? And so, it's okay, compose myself. I need to just pick up the phone and call this woman. I'm not engaging in an email battle with her. And I get into the conversation. So, tell me about where you're coming from. What are you hoping for? What are you concerned about? And after about 5 minutes, we were in a deep conversation about the lack of equity that I see in my role in terms of girls and boys in our math accelerated classes. And then before you know it, she's saying, well, my daughters graduated from Shenandoah and both went on to become engineers. And it was so wonderful that they were able to be in math accelerated. And I said, exactly, that's what we want. We want everybody to have this kind of access. And I can tell you right now, it's embarrassing in my seat to sit here and say, not enough girls are in our accelerated math program. That is a foundational concept of equity that we support. And so then when we get into critical race theory, we talk about, no, we're not doing that, but we do promote the concepts of equity for all. So that conversation went from me dreading it to, wait, she's thanking me when she's hanging up. So it's really about finding, like, where is our common ground? How do we listen? How do we build a bridge, of commonality? And then move forward from there. Do I think she probably went back to believing that critical race theory is horrible and that equity isn't great? Yeah, maybe. But if I can just have her leave and say, but it is really important that they start looking at who's in their accelerated programs. And that can be the narrative at, not to stereotype, knitting group or book club or, fire lady auxiliary, wherever she is, I'll take it, right? So it's about building those connections. In terms of resources available to build political skills, I think we all need, probably most important for all of us is just having an honest broker in our lives and in our conversations. And when I say that is after that, getting off the phone, right? Or before I even make that phone call, I need a chance to vent, right? And whoever that, like, oh, I've got another critical race theory call I've got to take, and right. And so I need that opportunity to just say, like, oh, here we go again. And then I need to surround myself, or I need to be that person for somebody else to say, and it's our job to have these conversations, and it's our job to move the needle, and it's our job to listen, and it's our job to build bridges. And when one of us right? We're a large district, and Shenandoah, I say large, just under 10,000 students, so medium size relative to some of the really large urban areas, but sizable. We have enough of us doing the work that we need to be there for each other. And it can't just be, oh, you're right, that person's a jerk, right? Because it's easy to fall into that trap, but it's more, okay, I gave you that moment to vent, and now get back out there. And now we need to hold up a mirror too. Did we communicate not a complete message? Is what their issue, does it have validity? And could we have included that in some of our messaging? So it's really about making sure that we are holding each other responsible for leading the entire community, and not just those who we believe agree with us and represent us and are heading in the direction, at least at the outset, that we think needs, and will help move our purpose forward.
So I'm hearing you talk about the resource of colleagues in many ways, and support as well as critical friends who can help you keep your eye on what you're actually trying to accomplish. Are there other tools or resources that folks have brought in, Kevin or Cami, that you'd think about that have helped you with political skill, or with your relationship with the public, and bridging those tensions that might come up with the public?
That I think that's such an excellent question. I'm curious I mean, Tammy, I think you're in an area probably that might be more resource rich relative to just those really good, thoughtful dialogues, conversation, facilitation. In our case, we've used a tool called Thought Exchange that I know, David, you're very familiar with. I'm not sure if everybody knows, to really gather a lot of feedback in the community, respond to that feedback, create an open dialogue where people can anonymously share thoughts, ask questions, make suggestions, and rate each other's thoughts, which kind of pulled people away from just doing that on their own on the Facebook parents page and then stewing in that, like the same 70 people or 7 people with 15 comments each. And that's been helpful. I think, though, what I think about in terms of a resource here is just, you mentioned colleagues, wildly important, board members that are on the same page, but that you can speak to and, have these thoughtful conversations. And I think that really helps. I think, though, colleagues is certainly a big piece of that. I can't think of other resources other than trying to find ways to facilitate conversations and create structures to manage the politics and the discourse using tools like Thought Exchange. I saw somebody in the chat commented on that, just to be able to open up the dialogue and invite the dialogue, and then have these structured, facilitated conversations. And in some places, I've had the opportunity to work with a couple of boards themselves on conversations with them and their superintendent about a system for managing their meetings and support them. Again, that's a colleague to colleague. We've done some of that work through LEAF. The School Boards Association does that as well, to just help people think through how to manage in that moment, that dialogue, and manage the politics of that.
Yeah, we actually, part of the work of pushing our equity agenda across our district. Again, I should have started at the beginning with the fact that when I became superintendent of this district, we were embroiled in a geographic battle. And that battle was centered around a diversity plan that was approved and was being supported by an external organization. And it was cloaked in mystery a bit. Folk didn't feel as if they had access to understand the what it was and what it hoped to achieve. And so imaginations ran wild, and all communication had broken down. And so when I took over, I had to sort of freeze that energy, freeze that thing. One, because it was televised, the disruptions in our council meetings and community board meetings, they couldn't be held. The communities wouldn't allow them to be held. They were just so contentious. So that provided an opportunity for me to think about how do we bring folk together around a common goal. And so I utilized the CRSE framework, culturally responsive sustaining education framework, formed prior to this. And it was a great tool because, one, it's public, it's on NYSET site, it's readily available, it's not a mysterious thing. folk could easily access this resource. And if you think about the 4 principles connected to CRSE, it's what every family or every parent wants for their child: a welcoming and affirming environment, high expectations, inclusive curriculum in some ways, and then ongoing professional learning. That was accessible for them. They could wrap their heads around it, they could understand it. And so I use that as the tool to sort of like the wedge. What do you call that thing that wedges something open? That was my wedge, in order to begin the conversation around why equity now, and why we needed to examine our enrollment data, our performance data, the socioeconomic sort of threads that seem to pull achievement right along with it across our district. And so utilizing that tool, I did what I did with our principals, right? To lead them through understanding and identifying what it looked like at Community Education Council meetings. We just had, take 2 on many of those times. And so at a council meeting, I would introduce a pillar and show them artifacts from the school, really celebrating the work and the learning happening in schools connected and associated with each of the pillars. And that began to open some space for our families to say, well, maybe we'll give her a minute, and maybe I'm open to hear a little bit more about this. She's not saying that there won't be a seat in this highly sought after school for my child. What she's saying is that we need to do better in terms of ensuring that these principles are true no matter where a child sits. So that's what we used and still continue to use, truthfully.
I like how we brought forward a technology tool, a kind of a social engagement tool with thought exchange, and then also framework, like a culturally responsive framework that you brought, Tammy, for your community. And a number of you talked about the importance of essentially dispelling mistrust and hopefully creating trust. What people made up in their minds, I think Tammy said, what people were making up because they didn't know necessarily what we were working on, and just the chance to be able to get a wedge in the door to try to help folks give you a chance, just to be able to begin to explain your the position of where you were trying to take your system. What are some of the strategies that you've all used to try to create positive relationships in your community? Maybe Elizabeth, we could start with you. Like some of the things that you've done to help create those positive relationships.
So we've been trying to make sure that our communication is regular and posted in a number of places. Like this coming Saturday, we have another community conversation that we will live stream out. And do we get a lot of people joining live? We always wish we had more, but then we'll go back and look how many people watch it on YouTube. And that will remind us of the importance of having that available. And so having like our messaging, what gets so lost so often in the conversation is it's the yelling, right? Masks are important, no masks. Meanwhile, we have school going on, right? So in these conversations, we're able to say, and we're excited, we've been able to get some field trips off the ground again, or yay, we're doing, the Ronald McDonald House charity, whatever it is that we're doing across the district, we're able to use these communication forums to bring back topics really specific to education that are somehow lost in all of the screaming, but really so fundamental to what we're doing in schools. We also found putting out sometimes that we are weighing all this information, or we are awaiting information from state education department. We're not just not sharing information. We are awaiting. We will then sift through it. We will think about it thoughtfully and all of the implications, and we will then come out with some sort of statement response plan. And there will be an opportunity for feedback at that point. And so sometimes just telling people that we are thinking, right, that we are planning, because their assumption sometimes when they're on the Facebook page is we're doing nothing, or we're plotting if they can't hear or see what we're doing. But when we say, no, these are the steps that we're taking right now. We know that you're interested in this. We're very interested in this also. And we're going to be in touch when we have the information.
Kevin, earlier you spoke about listening. That was one of the first things you said, was just how to try to listen first was one of the things that you did to try to help engage your community. Would you credit that as one of the essential strategies to try to build positive relationships? Are there other things that are there success stories you could tell where you've taken a critic of someone coming at the district from a very ideological fixed perspective, already come with prejudgments and mistrust, and you've been able to turn some positive relationships out of it? I mean, are there some stories like that you could tell, or one?
Well, I like how you finished with or one, because the reality is in the current environment, our definition of success probably needs to be clarified and the bar may be lowered. So part of the definition of success might be that we survive to fight another day, or that we're not yelling at each other, or that we're leaving something respectfully, right? So yeah, I'm glad you bring that up again, because as I was listening to Elizabeth and Tammy, the reality is some of these things, yes, there's tools and there's frameworks. Glad we articulated those, but we're back again to dispositions, I think, and behaviors, right? So they're somewhat hard to define or get training on, and some of them depend on who we are, or just over time learning that we could be better in a conversation, being reflective after the conversation. I think, how could I have steered that another way, and being okay with it not being okay, right? Like I'm a people pleaser and I want people to walk away. I feel like through enough language, I can maybe convince somebody. That's just probably not going to be the case. And so it's going back to, how do I make sure I'm presenting thoughtfully and acknowledging that there are different perspectives? Masking is a good example, right? And the language we use around masking, or even vaccination. I was receiving feedback at times about continuing to promote vaccination, or when you continue to keep talking about masking, it's so frustrating to me. My family feels different. Well, I had some pretty strong feelings personally about that. I have an immune compromised parent. I felt really strongly about the work that we were doing. I really tried to be thoughtful about it. At some point, we reached our density in terms of vaccination, and it wasn't thoughtful to keep putting it in my weekly update. I didn't need to do that. If you weren't vaccinated by that point, you probably weren't going to get vaccinated. And then be thoughtful in the way that I phrase things, or the language that I use, so that it didn't come across as judgmental of anybody, but it provided the information that was necessary. As much as I could, how could I be Switzerland in some of the conversation? So, some of the practical strategies, we used video also. I started to do 2 to 3 minute videos every Monday for a period of time, and I called them Just So You Know. It literally was just in the vernacular. I thought to myself, I'd read Facebook and say, I want to say to somebody, hey, just so you know. Literally, then I did that video for weeks, these 3 minute, hey, just so you know. Like, I will just tell you the information. You don't have to go there and stir about something that's not true. And I made them positive, upbeat. They weren't sarcastic or negative. I might be describing them that way, but they were really just, hey, just so you know, this is what is going on this week and the great work that's being done by people. And then I also figured out a time frame where I thought that I should stop doing that, because it was probably getting annoying for some people, right? So monitoring your strategy and changing courses at some point is important. But I think just really openness, honesty, being responsive. I also will say, when I say openness and honesty, as much as I'm saying we need to thoughtfully listen and be respectful of other perspectives, also being honest when you disagree is important, but finding a way to do that respectfully. So we had a person that was coming to board meetings for a very long time, conspiracy theorist, I would say. I mean, I think they would probably describe themselves that way. They wouldn't say it's theory, though. They would say it was conspiracy realist, and would present things that just made no sense whatsoever. I mean, like really far out kind of things. And it's not okay to let some of those things just sit either. I think in our role as leaders in a public health crisis as well, it is important to clarify information. And that notion that the Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, you're not entitled to your own facts. You are entitled to your own opinion. Finding a way to nicely say, thank you for sharing your information that is important to you. I will say, because I think it's important for our community to hear what we are receiving from the health department or from the CDC. And I recognize that you don't agree with those sources, but it is our responsibility, because those are sources that are thought to be what we should be following, that this is the information we've received. It is not to diminish your perspective, only to point out to those watching and listening that we have different information and see that differently because of that information. So there's ways to get at that. And then in cases where it was marginalizing to other human beings. So I look at the questions raised about the book Gender Queer and frankly, there's crossover between the same group of people raising these questions, and to look at them and honestly say, you have a very different perspective, but that perspective marginalizes other human beings, and that is not okay. I don't expect you to agree. We do expect, though, in this room, in this space, in these discussions, that we don't marginalize other human beings. And you may feel as though that book is pornographic, but we would like to make sure we're pointing out that it describes a human condition that is relatable for many and is important that our kids have the opportunity to recognize themselves in the work that is in front of us. You are entitled to your own opinion, but this is who we stand for and what we stand for. And that gets at the point I made earlier about kids are watching, right? Kids need to hear that. And I received numerous emails from our LGBTQ students and non-LGBTQ students, but allies saying, I'm so glad that you pointed that out because that's who I am as a human. And thank you for defending me as a human being. So I just would, again, I go back to like the dispositions and being honest, but I think you can do that without humiliating the person at the podium. They may choose to be upset or humiliated with you, but I really found that 9 times out of 10, you could get to a better place. I will also say, now that I haven't gone on long enough, you mentioned, did you walk away with good relationships or do you have success stories? I will say with several of those people, by being respectful, maybe approaching them before the meeting or after the meeting to develop a rapport and say, I know we see things differently and you're entitled to share however you feel. But I just need you to know that this is something I feel the need to say as well. I think that helps. And in some cases, some of the anti-mask people in particular, I thanked them for wearing their mask, even though I knew they disagreed with him, and made sure that that was very clear to them. I really appreciate you following through on what is the rule here, even though I know you disagree with it, so that we could hear your opinion. And then approaching them, we had a group of people come to a meeting and beforehand they were ready to like basically make it a disruptive environment. We left the board in executive session away, came down and talked to this group and said, listen, the board wants to hear your perspective and the world should hear your perspective because we're live streamed. But if you won't wear a mask, we won't have a meeting. So we're not going to have any kind of conflict. Nobody's going to be removed. Nobody is going to be dragged away. We're not going to do that. But we can't have a meeting unless you put your mask on. And please feel free to say, we totally disagree with this. But if you're going to get your point across, it has to be done with a mask on. And then we can go ahead and do this. And I really do find if you do that in ways that are non-confrontational, people do generally respond. I realize there are outliers to that many of our colleagues have had to deal with, but those seem to be strategies that work.
So you brought more to that answer, I think, than I expected, and a lot of layers to it. One of them, and one of them is, first of all, understanding that we're not. That I heard you say, we're not people pleasing in the sense that we're going to make friends with everyone necessarily as our objective, but by setting norms and by setting a tone of respectful expectations, and also by validating their own honoring of those expectations. Thank you for wearing a mask, even though you disagree with this policy. You're actually giving them dignity at this very same time that you're allowing them the space in a democratic, institution to be able to speak at the board meeting. So that's really critical, and I think it gets us away from the notion of positive relationships as you're going to necessarily make an ally of every single one of these individuals toward the direction you're trying to take it, but put it maybe to something broader. I guess either Elizabeth or Tammy. Any other points that we should talk about from the standpoint of individual relationships in communities, like how the strategies that you're trying to do with your staff to create individual relationships, in the context of political tension?
So yeah, and feel free to chime in here, Tammy. In terms of relationships, I think I appreciate so much of what Kevin said. I sometimes have to, I guess we all have to think about people's intention. The story about the going out and talking with folks, saying we want your perspective to be shared and we're not going to be able to have a meeting without it. It's really helping others get to what their intention is and not getting hung up on the way it is coming across. And I find we have to do that sometimes with our internal staff as well. When they cross a line that leads us to having to defend something that they've done, rather than jumping on them and saying, well, what are you thinking about trying to do a debate about critical race theory with ninth graders, right? Like, you know that that's going to be an issue. Instead, going at the intention, like, okay, so you are a thoughtful educator, or you are a community member who has this very strong held belief. What are you hoping to accomplish with that? And helping people figure out ways to fulfill their intention or communicate their intention in a way that allows that to happen without getting hung up on the how, or the issue that happened at hand. So I think really focusing on intention and us taking the time to figure out what that is, and to Kevin's point, and Tammy too, like, there are some things that we just can't support. Like, I can't give a platform for that, but I can help you learn where we're at, and we can build together towards something that we can work from. So I think not getting quite so hung up on, and we've had some ridiculous dramatic displays that are very hard to defend. But then, once I calm a little bit and drive home and think about it, I think, okay, what was that individual's intention? And was that our takeaway from that? And how do we build forward from there?
Yeah, I just had a flashback when you said that, Elizabeth. There have been some pretty scary moments in some of our meetings, and I think about that. I think that this work is like a universal masterclass in customer service, right? Figuring out how to get a win-win out of any situation is really, it's a big piece of the work. It's a huge piece of the work, because there are, at the beginning and the end and every time in the middle, we are human beings with our own beliefs and our own perspectives on many, many different subjects. And in some ways, Kevin, we are Switzerland all at the same time. So sort of living in that space can be challenging, but we understand it, right? You don't get here without sort of lots and lots and lots of professional practice and in existing in two spaces. But I do feel what has been successful here is sort of the reach one, and have those small conversations before the big conversations, or even, messaging offline or sending a note. When you send your cell phone number to someone that says, I'd love to have a conversation with you about how we can move forward. I use that. So the majority of this district has my personal cell phone number, and I'm so thankful that they don't all call me at 11 o'clock at night. But I do use sort of that each one reach one tactic a lot. And it's really about customer service, and it's about getting behind, is it just sort of a provocative moment? Because we have that as well. We have some agitators, and agitation can be good. We also, our community board meetings, as everyone, is a public space, but not every board in New York City, DOE, we have CECs, Council of Education, right? Our Community Education Council. And not all CECs are equal. They don't have the level of engagement that we have really developed in 28. And so we have folk coming from everywhere, looking to engage the conversation, but they're coming from their own unique perspective. And so even in that context, it's about, some member of the council or some member of the district team messaging them offline to say, we'd love to have a conversation with you. Would it be possible to offline for a few moments? And so it's that masterclass in customer service. It's really figuring out what it is that we're seeking to achieve, and working hard to have the win-win.
That's great. Tammy, I wonder if I can just because when I hear you talking about the work that you're doing in your system, I really hear you kind of doing cultural work, and it goes deeper than the individual interaction with this particular critic that's showing up for the board meeting. It goes much deeper than that. Can you talk a little bit about leading a supportive organizational culture that can help be problem solving and help keep the conversation productive, even when sometimes the forces of school leadership sometimes feel assailed from the outside? How do you set a tone and a culture in that direction?
Yeah, so I always think that the people are watching, right? So I try to behave in that manner, right? You're always mic'd. The film is always rolling. And, you know, when I was selected as superintendent of this district, I didn't get to hire a single person. I didn't get to bring a single person on board. This was a ready-made team that had been together for 7 or 8 years, so they knew each other really well. They had a system, a way of being and engaging, as was true for the principals as well. And so I thought it was important. We don't always want to do this work. And so I'm sorry, the street noise is maybe loud, but I'm going to try to speak over it. We don't always want to do the work of setting the culture or setting the tone for how we will engage. But early on in my leadership, there were these opportunities. I had some members who were engaging in some anti-LGBTQ conversations and comments and things of that nature. And I thought for a few seconds about how to respond to that. And at the end of the day, I just leaned on that part of me that wants to show up in the best way for the history books, right? And so it was a very strong conversation with my district team, but that was also a written conversation, I have to be honest with you. But I think in some parts of that, when I began to sort of team build after that event, I had to make it clear what we stand for. And that has to be true in every aspect of your professional performance. Like, I don't dictate I can't. None of us have the power to dictate what anyone does in their off time, in their private time. But when I am functioning in this role, and when this team is functioning in its role in every way, we have to hold a standard. And sometimes that lesson is not comfortable. It's not comfortable. I get that. Like, I get that was a risky thing, but it was important for the work that we had to do moving forward. We could not solve or soothe the damage that was done with the integration, the diversity project, if we couldn't be on the same page around how we intended to communicate the value for every human being. Every human being. Because some folk like to distill it down to a black and white issue, right? And we know that equity, right, is not just a black and white issue. It is, but it's not just a black and white issue. We have equity issues in connection to learning and ability. We have equity issues in housing. We have a ton of equity issues, as does everyone else. And so it was important to get our district team members as well as our principals on the same page. And that's my responsibility, right? Like I'm clear on that. And that was something that was difficult to achieve, but it was necessary, right? So in addition to sort of like offlining with people and the customer service, it's also about setting the tone for what has to happen and what will be the reality of who we are in these moments, because that's going to be the foundation. That's the foundation. Like, we got to make sure that cement cures, right? That's the foundation upon which we'll build everything that comes after.
That's so insightful, and the tone at the top when you speak about it, I mean, just so clear. Kevin and Elizabeth are similarly, I guess, this pivot from that we've made in this conversation right now, from the leadership work relating to the individuals, the individual challenges, to kind of the cultural work of how do you try to really set tone at the top in a way that permeates your system, because you're not the only person engaging with your public, right? It's also your staff and your principals, and you want to make sure that you have the right tone at the top that can help position you culturally well for that. Kevin or Elizabeth, other things that you might share?
I think you bring Tammy in to express it for you. I mean, I was really moved by that, and your directness, even your tone and your voice and your certainty in what you said. You're standing very firmly in a space that is important for us to stand firmly in, emphasizing value for every human being. You said it multiple times, for every human being. I think being very clear on that. So I don't want the message to be lost either in this conversation when I talked about civility and about listening and about thoughtfulness and respecting other people's perspective. I do want to make the other point that you can do all those things and be very direct and certain about where you are and defending other human beings and standing for something. So being crystal clear on that, I would guess that in our community, there is no question from our leadership team, from our faculty, or from community members on where I stand with regard to these issues. And I have not done that in a way that was divisive or derisive towards other humans. I've just been very crystal clear and focused in that message. And I think empowering the people around you to do that. I think there are people on the far right of things in our community that would say, see, he's just he's woke. He's there go the libs again. They're whatever. Fine, no problem. It's really boiled down to, I'm respectful, I'm thoughtful. I haven't given them any ammunition to say he's not listening. He's got a personal agenda. He's got whatever. I'm very careful about that, but I have been unwavering in our support for particular issues. And I don't give people the opportunity to be critical based on other dynamics, like social dynamics or the way I've responded to them or my tone or whatever. We had a gigantic, like 16x4 banner on our front lawn for a very long time in the middle of town that said Brighton believes Black Lives Matter post George Floyd's murder, and made it very clear, this is why we're putting this sign in our community. And it's not just about saying it, but it's about living it. And these are the 9 things we're going to do over the coming year to make sure that our families recognize that in our space, in all spaces, but that our belief is that Black Lives Matter. And every single voicemail I got, I returned and engaged in dialogue with people who felt differently and felt differently about what they thought was the BLM movement and our support of a political movement. And every single one of them said, first of all, what would you like to accomplish in this phone call? And do you want to really have a dialogue about it? Because I'd be happy to talk to you about it. We had an experience this year that some of you are familiar with. I know David is, around the not using jingle bells anymore in classrooms. And it's a long story for another webinar, but essentially became an equity issue. And the most hateful people from across the country left voicemails and emails, and it was a story covered by Fox and Breitbart and all of those same sources. And it was this liberalism run amok and, you're trying to be so woke, et cetera, et cetera. We immediately put out a message directly from me that said, that's not what this is. This is teachers being culturally responsive, recognizing that something might be problematic. And isn't it better not to hurt a human being if we have the opportunity to not do that? This is not furthering a political agenda. It's not criticizing you, your faith tradition, your holiday tradition, but simply saying that in our classrooms, we should be thoughtful about the work that we're presenting, the resources we're using, and be respectful of that. Period. Done. Move on. So it's crystal clear, and giving our administrators the support to do those same things, but to know that they don't have to field every one of those. Send them my way. Ground balls are yours. Pop flies are mine. And I'm going to be clear on that. And I'm going to stick up for you and defend you in that, and not put you out there for that. There's a question in the chat, or a comment in the chat, about a board candidate talking about education, not indoctrination, and this person, superintendent, preparing a statement. I would simply say to people, one, the use of language like indoctrination, I think it borders on the disrespectful about another human being, or maybe goes way over that line. But the problem is, I read that and I'm disgusted by it. And then I have to really check myself and say, okay, wait a second. This isn't a democracy. People should be able to stand up and say, I think this is indoctrination. I don't like it. But we likewise then should be comfortable enough to look at them and say, we think of this differently, and this is why. This is the policy. This is the board's policy. This is the state education department's approach to this. And in this space, we don't look at talking about somebody's gender choice and their gender affirmation or assertion as indoctrination. Thank you for sharing your perspective, but this is how we feel, and this is what we need to emphasize in our school community in terms of embracing every human being, and then move on. So you don't have to create an argument or a debate. Now, granted, that person's behavior in response to that could then be poor, and you're in that bad space. I realize this sounds like a Pollyannish approach to expect them not to sit down grumbling, but I think there are ways to approach that. And having a statement prepared, Deborah Kelly's comment in the chat is excellent, around saying that there's a comment then the superintendent can offer after that clarifies it and then moves on. Don't debate in the moment. Be respectful of that, and then like Tammy so eloquently expressed, be firm in your conviction and express that very directly, very clearly. That sends a very clear message, I think, throughout your school community.
So I totally agree. Thank you. And I would add to that by saying we have to be awfully careful about allowing education to get so narrow in its scope that we're really not turning out students of the world, students who are prepared to uphold the how sacred we hold the United States, the Constitution, the great experiment called democracy, right? That's what this is. And public education is designed to make sure we have an educated citizenry that can uphold a democracy. And part of being educated is knowing what you know and knowing what you don't know. It's knowing what you agree with, but also understanding the argument or the counter argument to it, right? It is not this, I worry that we're heading into this place that, it's like the Cultural Revolution in China where the people who were the smartest in society were put into the closet. That's just a frightening place to be. We have to remind and be the keepers of this idea that if we truly are pro-American, if we truly are pro the United States within a global society, that is done best through the highest levels of education of all the people. And when all of the people have the highest level of education, that makes all of us the best neighbors. And even if you look at it from the most crass perspective of who can financially support themselves versus who do we have to support, those who have the greatest education, the greatest confidence in themselves are best able to do that. So like the concepts of equity, the concepts of exposing our students to a diversity of opinions and depth of knowledge on certain topics, that's what holds us up as a really intellectually sound nation and allows our kids to go out and have choices after. And so we cannot narrow our scope so that we only talk about certain things. That is so parochial. It will not hold well for our students when they leave our institutions. They will not be able to be competitive in the college setting, the job market. And sometimes when we get right back to issues of equity, and I'll get the phone call and it will come up with something that's rooted in race. And like, our white boys. And I have to stop and say, I'm the mother of two white boys. And to me, this is non-negotiable. Like, I am not doing my job if I don't churn out two kids who care about people beyond themselves and can have a productive relationship in the larger community. And if that's how I feel for my own kids, that's how I feel for your kids too, because I know that's what's good for them. So the other question or the point that came up was, how do we support in the building level? I find our building folks are so customer service oriented. They will almost be so kind, so like trying to meet people. And to Kevin's point, when the call finally gets to us, it is defend almost always what they've said and done and their intentions as to why they've done it. And we are the ones saying, no, we're okay with this. I think we're at the point where we have to agree to disagree on this. But let me tell you, I'm just going to expand your perspective. I'm going to listen to you, but I'm going to try to have a broader conversation about why I think this is good for all of us and why we want to live in a nation where all of our students have the highest level of education, because ultimately it is what preserves our democracy that is supposedly so sacred, right?
It's very valuable points. I want to just kind of note, like in our progression of our conversation here, just the foundation, the depth of the foundation that I think that all the three of you have built so far. Just talking about the different ingredients, different aspects of your leadership, the ways in which you've approached these challenging contexts that are if not completely new, at least a lot more intensified in the last couple of years. And I want to change gears slightly here, and that is to talk a little bit about and it feels like we're coming out of this to some degree, but the onslaught of guidance, of unclear guidance, of interpretations, of departments that might differ in terms of guidance, and you're caught in the middle trying to navigate between a county, between the state, or between the Department of Health and the governor's office for a period of time. Where do you look for political leadership as you're trying to kind of discern where to go on certain mandates? I'm thinking about the different things that we had with masks, with vaccines, with our employees, the different things that had to go through during pandemic, especially. How did you look to kind of find political leadership as a way of kind of setting your compass in your own system?
I think one, it's almost like you had to pick a horse and then stick with it, right? So despite people's criticisms of the health department, the state health department, or the county health department, or the CDC, we just decided very early on that we're not going to kind of succumb to the issues regarding that and play into kind of this political game of left, right, who supports what and who we should be doubting. Is it Fauci or not, or whatever it is, and be consistent. These are the institutions we hold sacred. They are great sometimes and not so great others, but we're going to be consistent in that. David, I go back to the trials and tribulations that a lot of us faced during the 3 through 8 testing, opt-out kind of height of that. Well, we just kind of stuck with our consistency around, we believe in this work. We believe in the state ed department. We're not going to play in this game of being the doubting people over this or that or whatever. Let's be consistent in that. And then it was just kind of being our own voice. So being careful in our messaging to clearly say, this is what law tells us we need to do, what regulation tells us we need to do, and this is what we are going to do. We didn't introduce any variability or any questioning into that kind of communication. And then we stuck very consistently to that. And you and I, and I think everybody on the screen saw moments where colleagues, unfortunately at times, wrote their own personal opinion about regulation or health department, or kind of the sarcastic, hey, despite the fact that I'm boosted, I still got COVID, but oh well. And I think you should never be doing that. I think in our positions as leaders publicly, don't make it about your personal opinion in those cases, and in the doubting of regulation or science, and kind of feed into that craziness, even when that appeals to a certain part of our constituency, and probably more so in other districts. I think Tammy said it best around being Switzerland, right? I think that's super important, but Switzerland that's respectful of our institutions and just continue to say, this is the information and this is what we're looking at, and this is what we're going to come back to.
Did others, specifically during pandemic, because I think this presented some real challenges for all of us, did others of you kind of find ways of trying to keep certain variables fixed? Especially, we're operating right now, and some of you alluded to this earlier, is people will show up and they're bringing their own facts with them, and often and the policymakers sometimes weren't making it always easy for a school administrator to try to put their feet down on facts. So can Tammy or Elizabeth, can you reflect on maybe how you navigated that in your system as well?
Elizabeth, I don't know if you want to go first, because New York City is its own.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. One thing I'll say is almost like, it's good to kind of block out some of what we've lived through, and it's like, we're a few months beyond it. I will say to that point, I really appreciated how I found leaders found their leadership toward the end of it, coming out of it. In other words, at the beginning, we were all just waiting for guidance, and then we were waiting for reopening guidance, and then we were waiting for new reopening guidance. But at some point, I watched the leadership teams across the state, starting with NISCUS and district superintendents, really coming together and saying, wait a minute, we know this, we know what's needed, let's fashion a message and let's drive it home. And it was really powerful watching, and through, I thought, at least the vantage point I had to it, and Kevin, you may have seen different things, but I saw a lot of very respectful and proper use of influence. Like, here's our group, here's our representative group. We are asking for a seat at the table to have a conversation about the next stage or the next iteration. We are able to back you up and support you when we have thoughtful dialogue together. And then we can also share what our experience is leading our communities, and also the interface, with the local health departments and the county, and those of us working across with districts that straddle regions. And I guess I would just say I was so proud to watch leaders come together and kind of reclaim the leadership of school, doing so in a very respectful way, but saying, hey, we're here, we have some ideas, let's meet. And then when the state education department or when the county issues something, then it's yeah, we're all in on this. And to Kevin's point, we were never out undermining the message, but we could actually be out there very positive. And like we're in Saratoga County, multiple times we were able to say, like, we admire the leadership of the Saratoga County Health Department because they've consulted with us, and not just us, but local school district, and they're there for us 24/7 as we're making these challenging decisions. And I think it elevated both institutions, because at the end of the day, we're all just public institutions trying our best on behalf of education and public health. And the more we could work together on it, and I just saw a huge change over the last, I would say, 6 to 9 months.
So you're actually reinforcing the teamwork with those agencies at the very same time that you're collaborating, trying to get good work product out of them that will help give you good footing. You're enhancing that team. Tammy, do you want to reflect on New York City a little bit? And I know it is somewhat different than the experience of other
Yeah.
districts.
Article 52, it's
Yeah.
everything, right? Article 52. So the structure in New York City is different, right? Because we have a chancellor, a title that's, sort of our own designation, and then 45 superintendents under that chancellor. And we still have mayoral control. And that's a pretty big point in terms of this conversation. So if you ever want to clear a room with folk screaming in terror, just say guidance is forthcoming. That's the statement that will clear a room. You'll hear the groaning, because that's what we lived. We lived with that for such a long time. And the reason why that was such a sort of a pivotal statement with us is because we had to, in some way, we were really captive to the conversations that were happening outside of us, but about us and, on us, right? So the mayor had conversations with the health department directors, and as the sort of response to the pandemic developed, those conversations were had, and then representatives from the mayor's office would have conversations with senior leadership in New York City Department of Education at the chancellor's office, and they would sort of, my grandmother would say, ruminate. Is that a word? It's a Southern word. It's a big Southern word. They would ruminate and discuss back and forth what that meant, what that would mean for schools. And in the interim, we had guidance is forthcoming, and then guidance would come. And then something would change. The pandemic was such a dynamic phenomenon, right? Things were changing daily, things were changing weekly. And so it was difficult and frustrating to lead with regard to safety protocols, with regard to access to buildings, with regard to masking, vaccination. It was difficult because in like these big fives, Article 52, we have what we affectionately call our mothership, right? We have our chancellor's office and senior leadership, and that is where those guidance and directives come from. However, because we have mayoral control, we had to wait for an external office to make those big decisions. And literally, we were waiting. I cannot tell you how many times I submit a presentation to our Community Education Council and our President's Council and our Community Board Council on a monthly basis. And so I go back over those presentations sometimes, and I see it. This is forthcoming. It's forthcoming. It's forthcoming. And you have to say it with a smile. And so it made that time more challenging, if you can imagine that. A pandemic is plenty challenging. It made it more challenging because in some ways our hands were tied. The beauty, though, in that space, and I'm going to say it every day in every way, is what happens in our school buildings. That is the work. That's the soul work. That's the work. And so our school leaders really had to learn to pivot on a dime so many times around how they welcome students and families into buildings. I mean, some of them purchased tents and had them outside. And when inclement weather occurred, they opened either the back of the cafeteria or the phys ed rooms in order to receive families in a safe space, distribution of technology, like all of that. We still had to continue to educate as guidance was forthcoming, and folk were scared. And because we're in such tight quarters here in New York City, when it hit us like, hold on, Dorothy, the house and everything has been swept away into, it was just such a big deal. And so the beauty of that time is in my sight, is where the beauty always is. And it's in the school buildings. It's the school leaders doing the work of ensuring that our scholars get the education that they deserve and they have a right to.
And Tammy's words remind me that just as you know, the guidance is forthcoming, the uncertainty, the waiting, the things that change from one week to the next. How much of the work of leadership is building trust, and a number, all of you commented on building trust in the very institutions which were struggling because they were being pressed, and they weren't used to these dynamics any more than schools were. So I think, you know, holding all that up and also holding space for your community to try to build that trust. It sounds like all of you found your path through that, and thank goodness we have. I wanted to also bring out another topic that's actually recently hit headlines in the New York Times. There was an article this week even about Christopher Rufo, who is a person working at the Manhattan Institute, and the question, I think, which we brought for our panelists was, how do you when there are political campaigns that have some semblance of organization nationally, and you start to realize that some of the symptoms of that campaign are showing up locally. Maybe it's through money, through a political action committee. Maybe it's through messaging in a media machine, and it's informing perspectives that you're having to grapple with. How should you respond to that kind of like nationally organized campaign as it's affecting your local system? Have any of you seen that kind of operating? I mean, I think we've heard examples of different messages that have come out, but if any of you recognize that as kind of, okay, this is kind of happening because of some of these national trends?
You know, I've had a little bit of that, and in particular, the group that's across the country, the Moms of Liberty, which it seemed like for a very long time, it's probably continuing. I'm just not seeing as much right now, post mask being removed, that there was perhaps a weekly or bi-weekly message being sent. This is what you should be advocating for. Like, these are the 4 talking points this week. And in fact, you know, we received some information at different times from different places, not to sound clandestine or Watergate-ish about it, but that there was also a scheduling of, and these are the board meetings in our county coming up, who's going to go to which one. I mean, there was definitely an organization to that, and it was local, but also coming from a national perspective. I think that, and I know colleagues in other parts of the state saw the exact same thing. I think it was, you know, we tried to be really intentional about debunking the national talking point based on local, here's what our experience is. So there were things that came in the door in terms of public comment that made no sense whatsoever for the local context, but we knew must have been coming from a national group. And simply being positive and polite and responding and saying things like, well, you know, I know that there is a national perspective on that based on some of the groups nationally that are promoting that particular statement, but our experience locally has been very different, and this is what it is. And I think most people, you know, home rule here is so strong in our state. Local school district, I mean, the reason why we can't merge very much or very often, despite 700 plus districts, is people really do cherish and think that they're different and special in their own local environment. So it's almost about like capitalizing on that feeling and looking at those people saying, well, that might be the experience other places, but here we're in this space. This is what it's been for our kids, and constantly sending that message that, well, you know what, locally, that's not our experience. I'm not sure about other places, but let's just clarify for you here what we're doing and what our policy is, and kind of debunking it that way by capitalizing on that, you know, fidelity to the local experience.
And I would add to that by saying there are some things that I hear about that are well beyond the scope or control of individual schools that seem to be part of the platform. So I think that we have a whole host of people running for boards of election or boards of education, excuse me, that are going to be sorely disappointed to see how much time they have to put in as a volunteer, how many issues they're going to have to care about all of a sudden or pretend to care about, and realize how stymied they're going to be, that what they were hoping to be able to accomplish actually is not even something that is in their purview as a Board of Education member, or something that we have local control over, which that we have local control over some things, but the reality is we teach the standards that are established at the state level. Most districts get some level of federal funding. Like, to just say no to certain things, I mean, is the intention that we're going to be signing up localities to entirely fund education on their own, right? Those of us who get 25% state aid or federal aid, or 60%, is the local community expected to pick up the share when we start defying, what the expectation is of us? So some of the things that I hear just leave me thinking that some of the stances haven't been really well thought out in terms of where the actual ability to influence the decision is, and what the purview of a board member is, particularly acting in their own or a voting block. And when we happily take state funding dollars or federal funding dollars, that comes with an expectation about us following the rules. And so, I just think that there's a host of folks right now that are going to be somewhat disappointed.
I've got some traffic noise too on my end. I apologize. I do see Deborah's hand up, and this is a good reminder to me. If any others in our attendees want to put questions in the chat, we can pick those up, and certainly would like to try to address any questions that folks might have. I'm wondering if any of this, either Tammy or Kevin or Elizabeth, you found that you've been put in a position to build alliances in your community to help protect the district or protect the governance of the district against potentially those interests, and the way in which that might come forward in candidates, whether it's school board elections, whether it's a particular meeting. Have you found yourself building alliances with more reasonable voices that you feel that you can better engage to try to navigate a problem in your community?
I was ready to jump in with until you said more reasonable voices. Elizabeth, and really short, because I'm so thankful to be on this panel with Elizabeth and Kevin, because we get this is just such a rich conversation around New York State departments or district governance, and in New York City it is slightly different. Our Community Education Council, our elected members, the power dynamic is certainly different. So in terms of their decision-making ability, the power with which they, that's not totally true. There's lots of power, right? So there's different power structures. But what I do find in this district is that you had better put your time in with all constituents, especially constituent groups. There is not a single instance where ignoring a constituent group has given you anything positive or any positive benefit. What I have seen is that, when we allow folks to silo, it can get really bad. And we then, have folk talking to newspapers about each other. And the worst feeling in the world is, Sunday morning when you're like either heading home from mass to get a phone call from, senior leadership to say, did you see the paper? And here's your district with warring factions. And so for us, it really, for me, it's important that I stay connected to every viewpoint. And I've worked really hard to help people to see me as a space where they can at least be heard. There's no expectation that I'm going to agree with everything that's been said, but they do know that they have an open space to have the conversation, and the mic is turned on for everyone. And that works and has worked, because the opposite of that is just, I'm sure everyone on this recall, has experienced, sort of dissension, but, it was really shocking, taking over and this was, sort of street fighting. 2 degrees from that. And so what we have learned from that is that folk really want to be heard. They really want to contribute to the conversation, even when the contribution, I have to continue to use your stance, Kevin, like to I welcome you into the conversation, even when I don't agree with what you are sharing. And that's so for us, there's less sort of like direct power in terms of decision making, like deciding on the curriculum or deciding on those big areas, but there's plenty power in terms of public opinion and sort of tone setting in our district. So we just open the door and ensure that everyone has access to our district so that they can communicate their beliefs about everything.
I wonder, I deeply appreciate that. It allows you a kind of higher altitude to facilitate democratic dialogue. Do you know what I mean? And really, we're bringing all perspectives and honoring perspectives. At the same time, you're clear about where your values are, which you articulated earlier, and laid a foundation for that. I'm wondering if there are tactics, though, that sometimes have cropped up in some systems, despite, I think, the face of leadership that we're putting forward, and whether alliances might have been necessary. It's pretty explicit in some senses that some of the folks that are coming at schools are not necessarily coming with the agenda to try to necessarily change an institution from a conventional standpoint with their ideas, but instead to disrupt trust in that institution itself. So have any of you found yourself tempted, maybe, or have you found yourself needing to kind of think about tactically, how do I engage this force in a way that it's not going to be damaging to really the future of the governance of the school?
So I think it's really important for superintendents to be awfully careful, right? Anybody who's listening to this, are there things folks can do? Absolutely. But superintendents also live contract to contract, board to board. And so they have to, and they also are not allowed to, put their support behind a certain candidate, which I think hopefully everybody on the call knows and understands. But to your point, David, are there ways of building alliances? I think that getting out important information, making sure that people know, sometimes it's just district leadership that's been on the receiving end of really challenging emails or statements. I do think social media is helping and hurting with that, right? But putting people's voices out there in a more public forum. But I think that there are ways to partner with other groups that are invested in your school district, the leadership of your unions, not to be overt in any sort of way or do something that would be inappropriate, but to have real conversations about where do we see this district going and where is the membership of all of these groups to help get it there. And when we look at all of the candidates who are running, who are the folks that position us best to enable our staff? And many of us live in districts where the good share of staff members work in the system. And if they all come out and vote, that has a huge sway, right? And then who lives, who's in their household with them, who's positively impacted by stability and leadership and governance. And I think so sometimes having just big picture conversations about the importance of getting out the vote gets out those moderate folks who truly just want to see progress and stability in the organization, because they will remember that that is what's good for all the students and the larger community at hand.
It's interesting. I think probably given the nature and the background of our 3 different positions in different political contexts, I was kind of probably biting my tongue intentionally. And, I think Elizabeth calls it out well in terms of the touchy nature of superintendents getting involved in it. So for the professional benefit of the other people listening, I'm going to put it out there and say that ignoring the politics and the need for coalition building is a huge risk for people. And we've danced around and articulated in different ways this notion of neutrality in Switzerland, which is super important, and Tammy was right. But also Tammy was so spot on and being so clear in our convictions too, right? that you can do that while also honoring the fact that different perspectives in our democracy should come to the table. I think in a very similar way, being really aware of your politics, in touch with your politics, in tune with your politics in the district, like the local politics, not Democrat, Republican politics, the politics of who are the power brokers, who sways whom, and understanding who is speaking with what voice and how big is that voice and what does it really represent is super important. I'd make the argument that, yes, we can't put a sign in our lawn in an election. That's a mistake. And we need to be really thoughtful about the interactions we have over this. But I also think that superintendents that don't think about who's on the board, who might be running for the board, who might be interested in the board, and in some way protect the integrity of the leadership structure in the district, are probably going to end up then bearing the result of not tending to that garden. And I guess what I'm saying is don't put a sign in your lawn, but when good people are involved in leadership situations in the district, in the PTSA or in booster groups or whatever, it is okay to say to them, hey, you know what? You have a really thoughtful way of leading other people. You should think someday about being a part of the Board of Education. I think it's okay to say that. I think putting it on Facebook is a mistake. I think, again, putting a sign on your lawn is a mistake. But I think encouraging people, nurturing leadership, supporting other people, being thoughtful about that is okay. And it's really how you get at it, as opposed to whether or not you should pay attention to those politics and those competing groups. You've got to be aware of that. You're right in the middle of it. And remember, always remember, you might be working for one of those people or a detractor someday, and be aware of that. Then they will be the person negotiating your contract and thinking about your future. I think just be realistic about that. But I think you do have to engage in it to some degree. It's just with a great deal of trepidation, for sure.
Thank you. All of you for the comments and questions, or the comments that you've offered to those questions that we've asked so far. We have one of our participants asked, what leadership approach would you consider your go-to in handling a priority, urgent, and emergency matter? What style of leadership do you bring to that?
So I know you can't then ask the person it's like translating. You mean like a crisis moment?
That's how I read it.
I don't want to hog the space. I'll just say this. Emergencies are not for committees, right? Like I don't convene a committee and ask what everybody thinks first. And I'm not interested in like honoring all perspectives in the same way. So in crisis moments, people need you to be in charge. Delegate appropriately. It also doesn't mean you have to be in charge of every detail. Utilize your team and the experts on your team. Communicate clearly. Be thoughtful in that. Follow the plans you put together ahead of time. But it doesn't mean you get a group of people together and mull something over for 4 days and think about how to respond. Fire drill is a fire drill. Follow the plan. Get people out. Delegate appropriately. Be clear and direct.
I'm seeing Tammy and Elizabeth nod along.
He said.
What do you say? Okay, Kevin. Well done.
Thanks.
All right. I very much appreciate the dialogue that we've had today. I mean, I think this is a newer challenge for our leaders to have to navigate, and I think all of you brought such nuanced and thoughtful work, and you shared it so generously today. Just talking about the cultures that you've set, the both relational as well as systemic strategies that you put together, and really, I think the ways in which you serve your communities in such challenging times and continue to do that. I'm grateful for everyone's participation. Jerome, I see you're still there. I don't know if will you wrap us up?
Yes. I mean, what a thoughtful conversation. I hope that those who participated this afternoon as viewers, there's a lot of takeaways here for everybody. And, our society, I think Elizabeth talked about, I think you all talked about the contention in our society today. And I think Elizabeth summarized it well. I mean, if our belief in who we are as a country, you know, as a democracy, believing in the Constitution and what that means, we have to give thoughtful consideration to who we are as leaders. And I think each one of you has explored that quite appropriately in different ways and in different contexts, whether it's Tammy in New York City or, you know, 2 suburban districts, one in upstate New York, you know, here locally, and then in Western New York, you know, with Kevin's district in Brighton. You know, different parts of the states, there are different ideas that are going around, whether you're, you know, in rural New York or suburban New York or in New York City. So a lot of different views, a lot of different ideas, and you have to, I think it was Kevin's word, you have to provide dignity to those who are offering those views. Not that you agree with them, but that, you know, those people are human beings too. And so you want to serve them with dignity and provide them an opportunity to share their views, and hopefully develop some relationships with them so that you can move forward with the discussion. So you know, civility, and then, you know, I think this was a very timely topic. I think it's a seminar that we should share with all of our doctoral students who aspire to the superintendency for sure. And you know, this will be, we're going to put this on our website. You know, after it's recorded, I'll be talking with Vren about doing that and sharing that. We shared them last year. We will share this again this year as well. And I want to thank all of you for being part of this conversation this afternoon. And I wish you all the best. I mean, it's not over. Comment here from Janice, you know, what a wonderful, thoughtful commentary. I will use it this summer in my doctoral course. So I think we're, you know, as we prepare, you know, future leaders, especially at the superintendent's level or assistant superintendent level, even at the principal level, because they are probably feeling it as well in many ways. But I think central office gets the brunt of it, you know, from my viewpoint. So so again, thank you for everyone for being part of this. We really appreciate your time, an hour and a half this afternoon. And I hope that you know, we'll be putting these out. We have one more in at the end of May, supporting the social emotional issues of our school community. You know, not quite the same, but, you know, because of the pandemic and everything else, and not just students, right? I'm not talking, you know, just about students. It's all of us who engage within the school community, and so faculty and staff as well. So thank you, everyone. Vren, I think you're the keeper of the Zoom meeting. Are you still with us?
I'm here, Jerry. Thank you, everybody. We'll be sending a recording to all of the participants, and
Great.
I hope you can join us on May 24th. But thank you
Yes.
to all the panelists, and David, Elizabeth, Kevin, Tammy, and the planning team at Sage. So it's a great partnership and great conversation today.
Yep. Thank
Elizabeth
you.
and Tammy, I love learning from you. Thank you. I really appreciate it. We had a great
I'm going to
conversation.
email you both separately. What a wonderful
Yeah.
time tonight.
Same. And totally agree, Tammy and Kevin. Thank you so much. I learned some from both of you. And David, expert facilitation, like, wow, really impressive.
David just
Absolutely.
doesn't referee. He
You-
is a
you-
deep thinker that really provokes thought as opposed to just toggling back and forth between people. Thanks, David. It
Oh,
was
you guys
awesome.
made it easy. You guys made it easy. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Take care.
I have to go encourage public discourse now at our board meeting.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Go
Take care.
for it.